There's this great quote that I was tweeting a lot by Milan Kundera. He said, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." It was very poignant for the Philippines because what we watched in our May 9th elections is really forgetting our history, forgetting the past, that 36 years ago, we had ousted the Marcos family in a people power revolt, and now overwhelmingly voted for the namesake, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., for him to be president. So the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. I think that's the same. We can say the same things about colonial powers. And we've been impaired, in our part of the world, colonial powers. But again, the new colonial power, I think, that we have to deal with, aside from history, is really technology, because this is digital, and I'm going to quote Chris Wiley here, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, where he said that colonialism never died. It only moved online, because we are all of us globally are having to deal with the way the social media, American social media platforms, and now China, TikTok, Chinese has actually decided without consulting anyone how they are going to distribute information in all of our societies. When you talk about power politics, national and external, I think this is, I write this in the draft of my book, the world has always moved according to power and money. And after World War II, and World War II was the world came back from the brink, right? Nuclear war. This is something that I found fascinating when I went to Hiroshima and I covered the hibakushas, the people who survived the nuclear war. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 140,000 people died instantaneously. And those people who survived the hibakushas, they spent their lives, well, for one, their families, they watched people die, but they had to deal with the physical impact of this. But more than that, they spent the rest of their lives, and maybe this is Japanese, they spent their lives working for peace. That to me was like, in the midst of so much loss and so much, they bore the brunt of the worst of what humanity can do, and yet they came back with the best of humanity. So I guess I go back to this, right? That post-World War II, the world came together and said that, we're going to create NATO, we're going to create the United Nations, that we're going to protect ourselves from the worst of what we can do. And we did for a period of time. I think that time period is over. We are again on the brink of possible World War III, Russia invading Ukraine. I don't think we know the end goal of all of this, but I can say, in December last year, when I was writing the prologue for my book, I pegged it to 2014, which is when Russia had annexed Crimea, and you had the dual realities that happened then. But those same meta-narratives are the same reasons why 8 years later, Putin used those same meta-narratives to invade Ukraine. I'm sorry, let me specifically answer the power politics of national and external powers. I think those have always been there. They will always be there. These are, whether we call them politics, these are the way power and money moves. What keeps that in check, frankly, is the quality of journalism that demands and exacts accountability. And again, frankly, journalists, especially in our part of the world, are so much weaker than we used to be, because the safety of doing journalism today, the safety of our economic model, all of this is out the window. And you can see this in the most recent, the index surveys of press freedom and democracy in our part of the world. It's not looking good. So in terms of power politics and geopolitical influences, I think what we're seeing is a world that's changing drastically now. And I'm going to use Anne Applebaum's phrase where she called it autocracy Inc. The world is reforming, and Taiwan is in the middle of all of this, of course, right? As is the Philippines, because we are a proxy battle because of what the world calls the South China Sea, what we call the West Philippine Sea. That's a major waterway, and we become a little bit of a proxy battle. So I don't have a quick answer for you except to say that the world geopolitical power is now reforming. America is not what it used to be. This is very clear. You can see it. It was weakened with the election of Trump. Its institutions have been weakened under the Biden administration. I think America is looking for its, the how to stand and represent its values. But again, the same information ecosystem, the same dysfunction is happening there, and America always was the target. And this kind of asymmetrical warfare online, Russian disinformation, I mean, this is a fact, right? There's a 1,000-page Senate report that talks about how Russian information operations targeted 126 million Americans in the 2016 elections. For all we know, Hillary Clinton could have been the president, right? That didn't happen. But what we do know is there's a far weaker America. The EU is kicking in a different way, but the EU has its own problems. The UK has just splintered out of the EU. Very, very similar dynamics. I mean, China's role is so much bigger. And when you put China and Russia together with autocracy or autocrats Inc., it becomes a whole different ballgame. So I think it would be great. I would love to hear more about what you think on this, and how all of the changing geopolitical power play is affecting our own domestic politics. And then finally, your second question about valuing freedom of expression, which of the leaders? Again, RSF, the Reporters Without Borders, has come out with its latest the World Press Freedom Index. There are others in terms of rule of law. We're not doing well in Southeast Asia. I want us to do better. But I guess this is where I also, I have utter humility in saying that who knows what is right for the world? I mean, I believe in liberal, inclusive democracy. But if all of this collapses and we move back towards a more fascist kind of world, this kind of simpler authoritarian leaders, perhaps exemplified by China, is that going to be bad? I don't know. I do know that I think it's important that as long as we remain a democracy in name and our laws, our constitution in the Philippines are based on these principles, that I need to continue fighting for that. But if it changes, you've seen this, and I'll be seeing Dmitry Muratov, the other 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's had to actually close. They've shut down Novaya Gazeta in Russia. I mean, they've stopped writing because now the cost of writing about Ukraine is off the scale. They can't function anymore. You can't use the word war to talk about Ukraine, and so they're down. They can't function. It's a different world. And I guess I'm trying to understand what that will mean and why people are choosing it, or maybe we're not choosing it and we're being insidiously manipulated towards that. But if that's the case, this is the time to do something about it. This is the time where we need to all come in and fight the battle for facts. Otherwise, we're going to lose it. In terms of the Philippines, whether it's democratic or not, I think we need to see what President Marcos does. Willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's democratically elected, right? But I will say I found it alarming that in his first address as president-elect, that he only chose to invite 3 media. Well, I wouldn't even call the other 2. I mean, 3 organizations, let's call it that way. One has just recently been given a franchise by the midnight kind of appointment by the Duterte administration. It's a group called SMNI. It's a group that is owned by Pastor Quiboloy. He is President Duterte's pastor. He's also wanted by the FBI for sex trafficking. And so SMNI is this group that has the form of news, takes the form of news, but I'm not sure it has the standards and ethics that news organizations demand. Net 25, which is the second group, is a religious organization that again has the form of news, but definitely infused with that religious fervor. So we're moving closer and closer towards kind of like fusing religion and politics, which the separation of church and state was one of the things that was in the Philippine Constitution. And then finally, the third news organization, only 3 were invited by President-elect Marcos. The third is GMA7. It was the second largest television news group before ABS-CBN lost its franchise. I was surprised that it allowed this kind of thing, because again, when we saw then President Trump do this in the United States, the news organizations, the journalists kind of came together. But again, the history of GMA7, it survived the Marcos years. After the first Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos, declared martial law in 1972, he shut down ABS-CBN. GMA7 continued until 1986. So the quick answer to that is TBD, to be determined. I certainly hope that our new administration actually works to unite a very fragmented society. We should not be this fragmented. There are far too many existential questions to have to deal with, to be so lost in power plays like this. And now that they've won with such an overwhelming mandate, I hope that the focus becomes good governance for Filipinos. The second question you asked is, what should Mark Zuckerberg do? Good gosh. Yes, I think Facebook, and we know this from Frances Haugen and the more than 10,000 documents that she released. This is the whistleblower, where Facebook itself knew the harms that they were unleashing. Mark Zuckerberg is the only one right now, and I'll say this for every single platform. The tech platforms are the only ones that have the immediate power to solve these problems, or to try to begin to solve them. So one of the things he should do immediately is something they did after January 6th. After violence broke out on Capitol Hill, you know what Facebook did? They have kind of like a knob, but they call it News Ecosystem Quality, NEQ. And what they did when the violence broke out is they tuned it towards quality news, right? So when they did that, what that meant is on CrowdTangle, which is how news organizations find who ranks, what are the top 10, all of a sudden in the top 10, you could see traditional news organizations, NPR, the New York Times, they came back up, and it was a nicer, this is Facebook itself saying, a nicer news feed, because news organizations can't just call you names, right? They have to actually be fact-based. We're liable, legally liable for what we publish. So that only lasted a few weeks, because what Facebook also found is that when it dialed up quality news, they actually had less engagement, which meant less money. So after a period of time, they then turned it back down, and we have what I call toxic sludge, which is pumping anger, hate, and conspiracy theories through our nervous system directly into our minds. So, a direct appeal. Mark Zuckerberg, do you really want to make humanity the worst that we can be? in order to make more money. There should be accountability for many of these things, but there are many actions that the social media platforms can take. At this point, they're choosing not to do that. Beginning in February of 2018, President Duterte actually banned our reporter, Pia Ranada. She was our Malacanang reporter, and me. I actually don't report on the palace, but they banned us from covering President Duterte. From entering the palace. That didn't mean we didn't cover him. In fact, it gave us greater freedom to cover what the government was doing over succeeding months from February 2018 until the campaign period. You know, essentially that informal ban extended to every Rappler reporter, not just in the Philippines, but all around the world. Well, so what did we do? We filed a case at the Supreme Court. Hello, Supreme Court, please remember the case we filed. We believe that this is an unconstitutional act and that we should, that the Supreme Court should address this injustice, this violation of freedom of the press. I think that's one. The second is, yes, most news organizations were not included in President-elect Marcos's first press conference. And, you know, as a result, no questions were asked about how President Marcos will, for example, follow up on the wealth that his family was accused of taking in 1986. You know, the Marcoses were accused of stealing up to $10 billion in 1986 dollars. And that meant, and up until now, I think the Philippine government, so 36 years later, the Philippine government only was able to recover less than 4 billion of that 10 billion, right? So you're still talking about $6 billion. That question was never asked. There were other questions about, you know, existing cases. I think that President-elect Marcos's position on this is that he feels like he's answered it already. I'm just quoting him when he says that, but the reason the questions keep getting asked is because he hasn't answered it. But I would suggest that he does answer the questions of real journalists, because if he does, then perhaps he could move on to be president, right? He is now the president-elect. That's a very different time, a different position. He will be treated with the respect that the office deserves. But if this continues to be a kind of power play and an avoidance of even a semblance of accountability, then it becomes difficult. So the quick answer to your question is, I don't know. You know, this is one of those things where you live your way into the answer. And again, in the end, journalists and governments want the same things. We want our people to have a better life, right? But we play different roles. Government will set a policy, but before that policy is pushed out, what journalists do is we make sure that government has actually thought through all of the different parts. We don't do our jobs just to be annoying. We do our jobs to help government govern better. So, you know, I hope that our countries in Southeast Asia in particular understand these checks and balances, that it makes for stronger democracies, that it helps them do their jobs better. And just to close in terms of answering your question, we'll just continue doing our jobs. And we're not in power, we react to power. But we do know the standards and ethics and the mission of journalism, and we'll continue to do that and be guided by that. Thank you for that question.